Hello, and welcome to another episode of Talking Till Dawn. I'm Martin, and with me, as always, is that master of scaremonies, Michael Whitehouse.
Oh, I see what you did there.
Do you think my stupid jokes at the start are getting a bit forced?
No, not at all. I love them. I look forward to them.
How's life treating you?
Life is treating me, I have to say, well. To say well.
That's good.
Life's got a gun to my head, so I have to say well. No, things are good. What about yourself, mate?
Yeah, not too bad. I'm off on holiday in a few hours. I can say that now because this won't be released until after I'm back. I'm off to sunny Iceland.
Beautiful. Have you ever been?
I have not. I've never really been any further north than Scotland. I thought I should probably go and have a look at a glacier or two before they're all gone.
Yeah, I think they'll be gone next week, so you're getting there just in time.
See the last little bit melt away. Might see some geezers, not the Cockney kind, obviously. Hopefully I'll get a glimpse of the Aurora Borealis. That's something actually that I've always wanted to see and I've never been able to, so fingers crossed on the weather.
I have seen it.
Really?
It is incredible. Yep, I was in a boat going out to Shetland.
Oh, nice.
Which is the sort of northernmost collection of islands in the UK, and well, I know you know that, mate, but just in case our listeners don't. And I'll never forget it. I went out onto deck on the boat, and it was during the night. It was pitch black. The sea was like glass, and that's what it looked like. It just looked like glass. Jesus. And above me there were these wisps of like green.
That's awesome.
Strangest thing ever. Unfortunately, before the era of, well, good camera phones. So I never actually took a picture of it. Instead, I actually lived in the moment and enjoyed it.
Yeah, whereas I'll be struggling behind a camera trying to get a glimpse of it through fucking rain clouds probably. But yeah, that sounds magical, man. That sounds awesome. Fingers crossed. Touch wood. Everything else.
Hope so, mate. Hope so.
But tonight we are staying put in Glasgow. We're finishing what we began in the last episode. We're on the trail of Bible John, Scotland's lost serial killer. If you haven't listened to the first part of this, you won't have a clue what's going on. I'm not doing an extended recap, so you probably want to go back and check that one out first. As with the last episode, this isn't going to be one of our lighter affairs. The things we're going to be discussing are gruesome, extremely tragic, infuriating, and really quite disturbing, if anything more so than part one. So be advised, if discussion of murder, sexual assault, suicide, self-harm, domestic abuse, or the loss of loved ones, if any of those is likely to cause you undue distress, I strongly suggest that you give this one a miss. We have plenty of more upbeat episodes, and we'll be doing something fairly light-hearted for our next one to clear the palate a little bit. If at any time you do feel you need support, please do talk to someone. There's no shame in being affected by this stuff. It's a human reaction to some very distressing subject matter. We hope no one will be too profoundly affected, but if during or after this you feel you are, there will be a couple of numbers in the show notes, or of course you can search for a crisis hotline local to you.
Also, I would like to say, if you listen to this and you're not affected by it, that does not mean you're a psychopath.
Maybe a little bit.
Well, yeah, possibly. But some people can firewall this sort of stuff.
Well, I think that's what we have to do.
Yeah.
I think that's what we have to do when we're researching and writing these episodes, is that you do have to kind of disconnect from it. I think that is a healthy coping mechanism for this kind of thing, to detach from it a little bit, but I think it's really important to try and keep one eye on the victims and try and bear in mind that this isn't just some entertaining horror story. This is something that's real. We finished the last episode with the murder of Helen Puttock. Helen was the third and final known victim of Bible John, an unknown killer of women who targeted patrons of a dance hall in Glasgow called the Barrowlands Ballroom. A man who quoted Bible verses and referenced scripture in casual conversation, accompanied his victims most of the way home before battering them, sexually assaulting them, strangling them, and placing their own used sanitary items on top of the discarded bodies. So, not a very nice man. Helen Puttock, in keeping with the established pattern, Helen was dumped in plain view, this time in the rear courtyard behind a block of tenement apartments, just a few yards from her own back door. A man walking his dog at 7:30 a.m. the next morning stumbled upon what he at first thought was a pile of rags, which, on closer inspection, turned out to be the brutalised body of Helen Puttock. She was still dressed, sort of, but her coat was ripped and pulled over her head. Her dress and stockings were torn, and one of the stockings was tied around her neck. She had been garroted with it. Helen had also been raped and beaten to, if such a thing is possible, an even more severe extent than either of the previous two victims, and there were bite wounds on her arms. As before, the killer made a calling card of the victim's used sanitary towel. This time it was found tucked under Helen's arm. On this occasion, he also unwittingly left behind a personal object of his own, a cheap cufflink which Helen had seemingly pulled from him in the struggle. You'll recall that the suspect seen on the number 6 night bus after Helen was last seen was bothered by a ripped sleeve. Now, when the body was discovered, Helen hadn't yet been reported missing. As such, the police initially had a body on their hands but didn't immediately have a name for their victim. They set up an incident unit at the scene and started canvassing the area for information. Later that morning, George Puttock, Helen's husband, approached the incident unit to report that his wife hadn't come home the previous night. Again, much like Margaret O'Brien entering the derelict building to find her own sister, if you remember that from the last episode, I can't even begin to imagine the dread this man must have been feeling at that moment.
Especially if he knew that a body had been found.
Yeah. And I think he was approaching the incident unit with that knowledge. Helen was in such a bad state that police didn't ask George to visually identify the body. Instead, they took a description of what she'd been wearing the night before, and unfortunately it corresponded perfectly. It was left to Detective Superintendent Joe Beattie to break the news. Later in his life, George was interviewed in the press about this, and he said, "I will never forget Joe Beattie putting his hand on my shoulder and saying, 'I'm sorry, son, your wife's been murdered.'"
Oh, God.
Grim. The one ray of light in all this, if you can call it that, is that for the first time, police now had a witness. A witness in the form of Helen's sister, Jeannie. You'll recall that Jeannie shared a very tense cab ride home with both her sister and her sister's killer.
That's stuck in my head since the last episode, about the change in demeanour in him. Like it was as if the mask was slipping already at that point.
Well, yeah, that cab ride is the source of almost everything we know about Bible John the person. So it's a really key sort of event in this whole story. Jeannie was utterly crushed by the news of her sister's killing. I think we would all be devastated in that situation, Mike. Especially knowing that you'd spent time with the victim and the killer. Yeah,
that would torture you.
Going over everything in your head and everything that you said and did and thinking of the things that you might have done differently that could have changed the outcome. Not that she has any blame here, but I think we would all torture ourselves with those thoughts in that kind of situation. As you might imagine, it was several days before she was emotionally ready to answer questions from the police, but when she finally did, she proved to be a very helpful witness. In fact, as I've said, a majority of what we've talked about in relation to this murder, the events of that night, and most of what we know about Bible John the person, comes from Jeannie's account of that cab ride. After this third murder, really confirming the pattern that had been suggested by the first two killings, any doubt police might have had that there was a single maniac targeting women at the Barrowlands Ballroom was fading fast. 4 days later, on November the 4th, police held a press conference and, as reported in the Herald, they announced to the public that they were looking for a man, I quote, between 25 to 30, 5'10" to 6 foot tall, of medium build with slight auburn reddish hair, styled short and brushed to the right. He has blue-grey eyes, he has one tooth on the upper right jaw overlapping the next tooth, fine features, and is generally of smart appearance. He is dressed in a brownish, flecked, single-breasted suit, the jacket of which has 3 or 4 buttons and high lapels. He has a knee-length brownish coat of tweed or gabardine, a light blue shirt, and dark tie with red diagonal stripes. He was wearing a wristwatch with a broad leather strap of military style. He may smoke embassy-tipped cigarettes. He is known to go to Barrowland on occasions and is thought to go alone. The man is thought to go by the Christian name John. He may speak of being one of a family of 2, his sister and himself, and of having a strict upbringing, and make references to the Bible. He is quite well spoken, probably with a Glasgow accent, and does not appear to be engaged in heavy industry. He may have marks on his face and hands of recent origin. The information presented in this press conference would lead Evening Times reporter John Quinn, in search of a suitably concise and punchy description for his headline, to first coin the name Bible John. So the name itself came after the last murder. This was to be the last murder, or the last murder decisively linked to the Bible John series. And some reasons why he might have stopped, at least why he might have stopped in Glasgow. I'll get into those in more detail later, but just to touch on that briefly, of course he knows there's now good witnesses out there working with police. He knows the cops are ramping up their investigation. He's the talk of the whole city. But I think more than any of that, remember, this is someone who has committed horrendous crimes in a very audacious and casual way. Someone who almost doesn't seem particularly scared of getting caught by the police, or with the arrogance to believe they're not capable of catching him. I think what spooked him, or one thing that might have contributed to that, is this. I think Helen put up more of a fight than anyone Bible John had ever forced himself on before. Remember the eyewitnesses who saw a dishevelled, injured man on the night bus? Remember the torn clothes?
Yeah.
The buttons that were ripped from him? Remember how Helen was described by those who knew her as a particularly tough woman? I think she kicked the living shite out of him. Maybe came close to getting the better of her attacker. Which might also explain the greater brutality that was inflicted on Helen after he did overpower her. Now, this is sheer speculation, Mike, but I think that would probably have spooked a man like that. A man used to overpowering and brutalising women, and the shock of that might have bothered him more than any number of police patrols, and maybe just for a moment caused him to feel unmanned. Gone your cell, Helen.
Yeah, definitely. But do you not think that, well, there's like the idea of escalation, so maybe she was more brutalised because Bible John's crimes were escalating.
He's just getting worse.
Yeah, because there was like bite marks and things like that.
Yeah, I think that definitely plays into it as well. I just thought it was interesting though, like the witness reports of seeing him getting on the bus and he's covered in scratches. He's starting to bruise.
So we know that officially this is the last death that's like officially seen as being a Bible John killing.
Yep.
So often people who are rapists have severe issues with masculinity.
Yeah.
And with being made to feel like they have a lack of power in their lives. And often this comes from things that happen early on in their life.
Yeah.
What's interesting about this is that, well, someone who is in that state, that if Helen had put up such a fight against him, that may be why he brutalised her even more. That's
exactly what I thought. That one interpretation of what's going on in Bible John's head, at least from some of the things he says in the cab ride, where he's talking about how he hates women who go out dancing alone, and he hates, what does he say again, adulterous women. He seems to feel very challenged and almost phobic of women who don't fit into that kind of meek, homely, wifey sort of mould.
Yeah.
And I think a woman who put up a fight and almost got the better of him would both shock and enrage him. So yeah, definitely. What followed all of this was, at the time, the biggest investigation in Scottish police history. Cops interviewed almost every one of the hundreds who'd been in the Barrowlands that night. An undercover team of officers was stationed permanently at the club in plain clothes and ordered to mingle as dancers. I think by the end of that operation, everyone could spot the detectives because they were the best dancers in the room. They were there every night. They even became known inside the force as the police formation dance team.
Do you know, I did just have like an image in my head of Saturday Night Fever, or even worse, Staying Alive. Sorry, that's a terrible joke. I apologise.
This is a little bit before disco, but yeah, that too crossed my mind. But Bible John never showed up at the Barrowlands again. Following up on the detail of the overlapping teeth from Jeannie's description and a bite mark on Helen's wrist, investigators approached every single dentist in the city and compiled a list of 5,300 local men whose records showed a bite similar to Bible John's. All of these men were approached, and it seems all of them were cleared, at least as well as you can clear someone when you've got that many people to get through. Detailed artists' impressions were again circulated, a hotline was set up for the public to call in with information. This did lead to over 1,000 new suspects, all of whom, again, cleared. The composite drawn was circulated all over the world, particularly at British Army bases, naval bases, even ships at sea, as there was a belief that Bible John may be a serviceman or a sailor based on some of his mannerisms, his unfashionably short haircut, his extended downtime between the first two killings, like was he away somewhere, and a small lapel badge that Jeannie couldn't identify but might have been some kind of military insignia. Glasgow police followed up leads from as far afield as Hong Kong, which at that time was a British Crown colony with a sizable contingent of British and Scottish civil servants and military personnel. There were several strong suspects who came out of that arm of the investigation, but once again, initial promise seemed to peter out to nothing. Back in Glasgow, cops were processing potential suspects on an almost industrial level. Poor Jeannie had to sit through something like 300 identity parades, but she never picked anyone out of a lineup as being John.
I hardly expect her to after 300.
No, and I think now that's a good point. I think now that we would probably say that sitting through that many lineups is going to have a contaminating effect on her memory.
Yeah.
But at that time, I don't think people were as knowledgeable or as kind of focused on the psychological aspects of that. However, she did recall that when the subject of golf came up, you remember that he said he didn't like football, he preferred golf.
Yeah.
John mentioned he had a cousin who'd hit a hole-in-one. Now, this is Scotland. There was something like 400 or 500 golf courses within a few hours' drive of Glasgow, and police looked into every single one, asking around for anyone who might remember hearing of a hole-in-one, which is not a common achievement.
Absolutely not.
No, I know some golfers, and I don't know anyone who's ever hit a hole-in-one. Probably know 10 or 20 people who play golf. I've never had anyone tell me that they've hit a hole-in-one before.
I was involved in a terrible golfing accident once.
Really?
Yeah, it was really bad.
Were you behind the club or in front of it?
There was a field just over from where we grew up. There's a couple of fields actually, and one of them we used to play golf in. And I used my brother's golf clubs. Don't know why he had golf clubs, because he didn't really golf, but he got a set of golf clubs at some point. And I went down, and there was a girl that lived next door to me. Her name was Kirsty. Funnily enough, that's my wife's name, not the same Kirsty. But there was a girl called Kirsty who was like 2 years younger than me, and I was probably about 13, something like that, at that time. And I can laugh about it now, but at the time it was terrible. Well, she was standing behind me, and I was trying to show her how to swing a club. And then I specifically said to her, right, now step back. And so she stepped back, but then just as I swung, she stepped forward for some reason. I hit her on the temple.
Fuck. And that is the story of the 5-iron killer.
Yeah. And that's how I started. I've never seen anyone run so fast in all my life.
Was she alright?
She was fine. She got some... I say she was fine. She wasn't... She had to get some stitches on her temple, but she wasn't like... I thought at the time like I'd blinded her or given her brain damage or something, and it didn't help the fact that the two of us sometimes were at loggerheads.
So you had a motive as well? God.
So, yeah. So, like, I used to get bammed up a bit about that, but I felt awful about it. But she was fine. So sort of know her. I still know her family now, and she's fine. Everyone, I didn't murder her. She's fine. Okay, she's fine.
So anyway, they tracked down golfers from across the UK who had hit a hole-in-one and interviewed them about their relatives, but once again, this costly exercise produced no substantial leads. For someone who was so reckless and brazen in his crimes, he was killing women out in the open in public places. He was seen talking and dancing with his victims by hundreds of witnesses. In no way was this some criminal mastermind. Bible John seems to have had what, if you wanted to be sensationalistic, you might call the luck of the devil. Detective Superintendent Beattie would say in the months following the final murder, "It is quite incredible how this man has eluded us. This man walks about, travels on buses, goes to his local newsagents for papers and cigarettes, eats out, works, and does things that any other person would do. Someone somewhere knows him and could give us a clue to his identity." And I think that illustrates just how in the dark, just desperate and out of leads the police were. At first, right after Helen's death, the cops had so much to go on, or so they thought. There was so many witnesses, it seemed like only a matter of time till he was caught. But as the months dragged on in the press and the statements given by police, you can almost see it starting to dawn that, against all odds, this guy might actually be getting away with it. The murders had seemed to stop at this point, and the case was not, and never has been, solved. One thing I wanted to touch on here just briefly is this detail of the sanitary items and the fact that all three victims were menstruating at the time they were killed. If he was targeting women on their periods, as it would seem he was, Mike, how on earth was he selecting his victims?
Yeah, it would be an unbelievable coincidence.
Yeah, was he rummaging through ladies' handbags in the dance hall? Did he ask them? Surely if some strange man is going around asking women anatomical questions or rifling through purses, some witness or some of the women he checked out but didn't kill, there must have been people who failed such a test and weren't targeted.
Yeah.
Surely some of them would have remembered an encounter like that and reported it afterwards.
I know it's an absolute stretch, but maybe it's not completely beyond the realms of possibility that someone could not consciously know, but could sense that, could pick that up somehow.
Yeah,
Hormonal shifts.
Yeah.
Affecting, I don't know, pheromones or affecting something that make them kind of, from an evolutionary standpoint, it would make sense for men to somehow be able to sense that in some way, to be able to pick up on it in some way.
You do occasionally come across this speculation that sort of takes things in a slightly kind of X-Files direction.
No, but I don't mean.
I know.
I know
You don't mean psychic or any of that.
Human beings do pick up changes in each other's bodies through sense of smell and things like that. And I'm just saying that I don't think it's beyond the realms of possibility that there's something in that.
Maybe not beyond the realms of possibility, but I think. Let's put it this way. I think there could be more likely reasons, and I take on board what you're saying. There maybe is something there, but I think the hit rate for that would be low. Then again, we only have a sample of 3 people, so you never know. I mean, it doesn't mean it's not true, but I have my doubt. I mean, he's not a dog.
Yeah.
but
he is a mammal, though.
That's true. As far as we know, maybe he was a reptilian. I think the police were of a mind that Bible John was someone who regularly had sexual encounters with women he met at the Barrowlands, but flew into a rage when the partner turned him down at the last minute, because, they're on their periods. I'm not too convinced by that. Today, it seems to me very much like a kind of older man in the 1960s view of things. Cops may be thinking of their own marriages getting knocked back by their wives or whatever. I don't think a refusal is what drove him to kill. First of all, I'm not convinced that the women who were killed had all been looking for sex in the first place. And if they were looking for sex, and maybe they were, what are the chances they would all have decided to turn him down at the last minute all for the same reason. A period isn't the only reason a woman might refuse to have sex with someone. There's no physiological reason it can't happen anyway. It also doesn't really jive with what we know about serial killers and how not all but most target and kill for the power and the sexual thrill itself, rather than the killing being something separate and incidental to the sexual aspect. So I don't think the police's explanation from the time would give us a 100% hit rate on all the victims menstruating at the time they were killed either. Some would have turned him down for other reasons and then been killed, if being turned down was why he was killing them. So you would have victims who otherwise fit the pattern but lacked that one detail. And there aren't any like that. I do think they were on some level killed specifically because they were on their periods and not because they knocked him back. And that seems to be the general consensus now. I mean, I suppose it could just be coincidence. You'd have about a 1 in 6 chance each time he killed someone. It could just be sheer chance. But the fact he made such a show of it, I'm not sure. Personally, I think he was targeting women based on this particular characteristic, and I think there might have been some behavioural cue that he was picking up on. Now, I'm not a woman and I wasn't alive at the time. I'm not 100% certain on the customs of these dance halls. But was it the case that, for example, women would usually leave their handbag in a cloakroom but maybe hold on to it at times where she might need something from it? Was he picking up on some detail like that and targeting them that way? That's just an example off the top of my head. There might be some clue like that he's identified. There is another, and we've got your idea on ice there just now. I mean, it's there about the pheromonal thing. That is an interesting point.
I love how you almost, but not quite entertaining it. Yeah, we'll just put, right, okay, Michael. We'll just put your wee idea. We'll just put your wee idea in the corner. Here's a ball. Why don't you bounce it?
I like it, but it also echoes a little bit of like the whole incel thing of like picking up on the hormonal thing. But you're right.
I don't know if that mechanism exists in human beings. Is what I'm saying, and all I'm saying is that I wouldn't be overtly surprised if either it does exist in some way, and that maybe in some people it's strong. That's all I mean.
There is another possibility, and it's much more disturbing even than that, but we will come to that a little bit later when we talk about one of the suspects. But first, let's talk suspects, okay?
Let's do it, man.
Let's do it. Officially, the perpetrator of the Barrowland killings has never been identified, but at different times there have been several strong suspects. Now, I've already said that police interviewed thousands of potential culprits without any luck, and I've said that Bible John never reappeared at the Barrowlands, and all the stakeouts and undercover operations were for nothing. That might not be strictly true. In fact, they might have come very, very close to apprehending the killer through some of these methods. There were some investigators on this case who, for many years, perhaps even to this day, of the few who are still with us, are adamant that they had Bible John in their clutches at the end of 1969. In the early 2000s, retired Detective Chief Inspector Les Brown, who was a member of the Serious Crime Squad during this period, latterly an author and private investigator, claimed that not long after Helen Puttock's murder, he apprehended a man in the Barrowland ballroom whom he believes to have been a very likely suspect for Bible John. This man drew the attention of undercover officers inside the venue when he started shouting and behaving threateningly towards a woman he had just met. Brown claims this suspect was a dead ringer for the facial composite that had been circulated, matched most of the details mentioned in eyewitness reports, and gave a false name when questioned. That name, John White. He also gave a false address at 28 St Andrews Street. When he was arrested and interrogated further, he was elusive and weird, but eventually he folded and provided police with his real name and his real address in the Gorbals, where he lived with his mum. The real name and address have been withheld, of course, because this man hasn't been rearrested, or hadn't been as of 2005 when this was reported. However, and I'll quote DCI Brown on what happened next. "We called in the officer in charge of the case. He walked around him once and said, 'That's the nearest yet, but it's not him.' We were told to let him go. What could we do? We had told the officer in charge, and the next day we were hauled away to another murder. After we arrested him, the murders stopped. That might or might not be significant. In hindsight, maybe we should not have let him go. Apparently this senior officer decided the suspect couldn't be Bible John based on a cursory visual inspection of the guy's teeth. I guess he thought his teeth were too nice and didn't have the trademark overlapping bite described by witnesses. Okay, but I think it wouldn't have hurt to dig a bit deeper into the guy. You know, it might be far-fetched, but he could have had the tooth pulled and replaced with a crown or something.
Yeah.
Still, this guy probably wouldn't have impressed himself on the memories of investigators too much beyond that, were it not for a chance conversation several years later between DCI Brown and another officer. On a different night, this other officer had also arrested a suspect, this time just outside the front door of the Barrowland Ballroom. And this time, the suspect is with a young woman he's just met, and he's getting ready to take her up the road. From the available accounts, it's hard to tell the reason for his arrest on this occasion. Was he arrested because he matched the description, or had he got into an altercation? It does make me think of the kind of belittling, domineering way Bible John spoke to the venue manager, and how Helen and Jeannie thought he would get himself thrown out. Are fists flying because he's being bossy and rubbing people up the wrong way? Anyway, whether it's a street fight or the police getting a bit rough with their man as they're arresting him, this suspect suffers an injury, and the police have to take him to hospital for some stitches. While he's getting treated, they take the handcuffs off the guy. The moment the cops' backs are turned, he jumps up, bolts out the room, and escapes out the back door of the hospital, never to be seen again. And they couldn't track him down because, you guessed it, this guy gave a false name and address. John White, 28 St Andrew Street. Same guy.
Ah.
And like I say, these two strange incidents, apparently involving the same man, matching the same description, and acting very oddly in and around the Barrowlands, were not pieced together as being the same guy until years later. It seems like a silly oversight, and in fairness it kind of is, but bear in mind, this is before computers and data sifting and automatic comparison of records. It took for someone to manually make that connection for it to be recognised. And it's all very incidental, but in the lack of anyone being tried and convicted for this, I think John White is, if nothing else, an interesting potential suspect.
Absolutely. The only thing I would say, playing devil's advocate, is that, especially with the fact that he ran away, that actually, even today, that happens quite often with police officers when they're accompanying people to the hospital. And I certainly know through like my family working, social work and things like that, that it often happens where people are kind of detained and are brought into hospitals and then they end up just running out. Yeah,
so what you're saying is that may not be an admission of guilt in an extremely serious crime. It may simply be the guy doesn't want to spend the night in the cells.
Why would he give the fake name of John, you know, if he knew about Bible John?
I think John was just an easy fake name to pull out your head. I don't know, it's a weird thing, isn't it? Like, it seems that people were still using the fake name John. I think the fake name John was just so ubiquitous that it didn't really lodge in people's brains that you kind of want to avoid that name. And I suppose in a way, that's one of the things that kind of detract a little bit from that suspect, because the fact that he called himself John isn't really that big a deal because so many people were using that as a fake name and as a real name, I guess.
Yeah, I was going to say, is it like a kind of pseudonym for, you know, like there used to always be the joke, there used to be the sort of running gag that when two people were meeting up to have sex at a hotel, outside of marriage, or they weren't married yet and that was taboo, they would give names like Mr. and Mrs. Jones or Mr. and Mrs. Smith. John Smith, you know, like it sounds like quite a generic name other than the ex-Labour leader.
Exactly, and I think that joke exists for a reason. And as we've said, people did use pseudonyms when they were going to the Barrowlands Ballroom because it was a meat market, because it was a pickup joint. However, in 2005, this was all passed to DSI Kenny Waters of the Unsolved Crimes Unit. essentially a cold case squad that was formed around that time to look into cases like this. But as of this recording, and this is 15 years later again, doesn't seem like anything's come of that, unfortunately. I would like to think that if he's still alive, this John White has been found, checked out, presumably cleared, but there hasn't been anything further announced on that line of inquiry. In early 1996, Strathclyde police exhumed the body of a man from a graveyard in Stonehouse near Hamilton, about 20 miles southeast of Glasgow.
Not far from where I live.
Nowhere's far from where you live on these podcasts, Mike.
I know. Wait until we do the episode on the Beast of Birkinshaw. I was right round the corner.
That's true, yeah. A man by the name of John Irvin Mckenna. Mckenna had been a serviceman. He'd been serving in the Scots Guards at the time of the murders. I haven't been able to find a picture of him, but it would seem he did match the description, and had been one of the early suspects in this case, but was excluded on the basis that he'd taken part in one of those identity parades and Helen's sister hadn't picked him out. However, come the 80s and 90s, and the arrival of DNA forensics, the police started looking back into some of these old suspects in the hopes that the new technology could shed some light. Now, the DNA fingerprinting of 1996 was not what it is today. The use of familial DNA in particular was very much in its infancy. Nevertheless, investigators obtained a sample from Mckenna's sister, she's still alive of course, and noted what might have been similarities with a DNA profile of Bible John taken from traces found on Helen Puttock's underwear. They also looked at dental records and believed there was a chance Mckenna's teeth had inflicted those wounds. And so a license to exhume was granted. John Mckenna had taken his own life in 1980. In the lead up to the exhumation in 96, there were a number of lurid stories in the tabloids about his suicide, which must have been very difficult for his family to see on the newsstands. I feel bad bringing this aspect up, but it's all been dragged through the papers and aired so publicly.
This is one thing that's, I think, difficult when we do, especially when we do true crime episodes, but even when we do episodes on cryptids and there's the dreaded spectre of whether people are hoaxing and things like that, it's very difficult to explore these things without looking at alternative explanations, and unfortunately sometimes that does involve wondering and speculating about. But like you say, if it's already out there, then
it's a tough one because some of this is really salacious. It comes from quite very tabloidy sources. However, if these points are or were true, then they're worth bringing up, and some of the more reputable sources haven't really reported on this stuff. So, but there does seem to be some degree of truth. But I think it's also worth talking about how these things were reported.
Yeah.
In fact, the whole investigation into Mckenna really was carried out in arguably quite an insensitive way. There was a bit of a furore about it afterwards, actually. But in fairness, the way he died is so very unusual and self-sadistic that it's hard to imagine how it wouldn't have had some influence on how investigators viewed this man. I mean, it's utterly tragic, of course it is, but the way the deed was done was particularly, perhaps even intentionally, shocking. Now, I'm putting a specific warning on this next section. If suicide or self-harm is a difficult subject for you, if either of those hits close to home, you may wish to skip forward about 5 minutes or so, okay? Alright, so excuse the tabloidy language. I think it, as I say, it is important to record how this was reported. This was published in the Glasgow Daily Record, so you know what you're getting, Mike.
Yeah.
30th of January, 1996. Bizarre suicide of Bible John. That's the headline. So already, the headline is stating that this guy is Bible John before any proof has been
I hate sensationalist news reporting. Drives me nuts.
Oh, it's going to get worse. The man police believe was Bible John may have killed himself for a thrill, in capital letters. John Irvin Mckenna died in a pool of blood after slashing a huge artery in his armpit. and the bizarre death may well have been the ultimate thrill of a sick psychopath, it was claimed last night. His death certificate shows he bled to death aged 41 from slashing the brachial artery which runs from the armpit to the elbow. Experts say blood would have spurted out at high pressure. Psychiatrist Dr. Prem Misra said, "The picture is of a psychopath. It may have given him pleasure to bleed himself to death." Dr. Misra said such perversion was very rare. He had seen 4 similar cases in 20 years. If he was Bible John, he may have become frustrated as his kick lessened after each kill. Mckenna may then have taken his own life in search of the ultimate thrill. But this Dr. Prem Misra is a legitimate consultant psychiatrist. I believe he was at one point, if he isn't still governor of Glasgow Caledonia University. I feel almost like he either knows something about Mckenna that the papers weren't able to report in order to come to the conclusion that he did, or, as I strongly suspect, he's talking purely in hypotheticals, but the paper is framing some cherry-picked parts of that as informed fact. You know, why would a psychopath kill himself that way? Oh, well, if he was a psychopath, it could be a kind of thrill-seeking behaviour, you know, that kind of thing, but they've picked it out of context.
It sounds like that.
Obviously, I defer to Professor Misra's opinion on this. What I can make of it in the article, impulsive and sensation-seeking behaviour is a common trait in psychopaths. If you work on the assumption that Mckenna was Bible John, and spoilers, I don't believe that, and I don't believe any of what I'm about to say applied to Mr. Mckenna. Just following the prevailing line of thought from the time of his exhumation, if you think he was Bible John and you view his final act through that lens, and that lens only, then the sheer gruesomeness of it does seem to chime, I guess. Cutting deep into your armpit to hit your, what was it, thoracic artery or something. If you're wired up anything like a normal human being, that's an awful way to go. So if you accept the narrative that he killed those people and then he died this way, Bible John surely was someone who got gratification from violent and macabre acts committed on others. There are some people who get gratification from violent and gruesome acts on themselves. There are people who self-harm or seek others to harm them, in a few very extreme cases up to and including death itself, ostensibly not because of depression and the kinds of things we usually associate with self-harm, but because they find some thrill in that. I must admit it's not something I personally understand, but it is a fact. And I'm not talking about people who like to get tied up and whipped and that kind of thing. At the very extreme end of what I'm talking about, look at Sharon Lopatka or the Armin Maivis Bernd Brandes cases for examples of what I'm talking about. I won't get into that right now. That's probably a future episode if we can bear to do it. Has anyone ever shifted from one side of that coin to the other, though? Or existed on both sides of that coin? Yes, arguably. Albert Fish, a horrific killer of children in the early 20th century.
Oh, I know an awful lot about Albert Fish.
Another very unnice man. Was also obsessed with self-mutilation. And he indulged in a whole range of extremely irrevocably damaging acts on himself over the years, apparently because he got off on it. One of the least shocking details of Albert Fish's activities is that after he was arrested and he was examined by doctors, X-rays showed 29 rusty metal pins of varying sizes that he'd embedded in his own groin. I think it's entirely possible that Fish would have eventually killed himself in some gruesome way, either intentionally or as a side effect of his habits, had he not been caught and executed for his crimes. However, I do think that's a pretty big leap in the Bible John case. I'm not sold on the idea that someone being into one of those things, harming others or being harmed, necessarily implies being into the other. In fact, I would say that those who are into both, people like Albert Fish, are probably the very rare exception to that rule.
This article you read, though, it seems really strange to me that, to me, there must have been other details beyond John Mckenna puncturing that artery.
I think so, but I think only papers like the Daily Record would go there. So I think Mckenna knew just enough about anatomy to believe that that was likely to be a fatal wound. Perhaps while he was in the military, he'd seen someone wounded in that way and killed. Maybe it had some significance to him. I think there's 100 reasons he might have done that other than a sexual kick. None of which would suggest any connection to the Bible John murders. Would more strongly suggest to me a poor guy suffering from a severe mood disorder or PTSD or something of that nature, rather than a violent psychopath. And it's rather a shame, I think, that he's been saddled with that. And I think maybe this goes to show how we're a lot more... Obviously, this was in the 90s, this was reported, and I don't think even in Daily Record they would report that way anymore. I think we've become a lot more sensitive and understanding of people and of mental health difficulties and things like that.
You would hope so.
Yeah, you would hope so. So John McInnes was exhumed in early 1996 at great cost and at great distress to McInnes's family. However, the quick closure everyone expected wasn't forthcoming. McInnes's remains were found to be severely deteriorated. He'd been in the ground for nigh on 2 decades at this point, and DNA technology being what it was in 1996, Strathclyde Police lab struggled for weeks and weeks to extract a usable DNA sample from the skeleton and eventually admitted defeat. What they were able to compare was inconclusive. A Dr. MacDonald, Professor of Oral Pathology at Glasgow University, examined the corpse's teeth and compared them to records of Helen Puttock's bite wounds, but even this failed to clarify the situation. He wasn't able to positively determine one way or the other if McInnes's teeth had made the bite marks. Ultimately, the Department of Biological Anthropology at Cambridge University and the Berlin Institute of Medicine came on board, bringing to the table what was then a cutting-edge technique, and they finally managed to synthesize part of a DNA sequence from John McInnes's thigh bone. It was compared to DNA from the semen stain, which itself was beginning to deteriorate, and they were able to get a good enough comparison to be able to state that their findings excluded McInnes as the source of that stain. So McInnes was cleared. After all of that, after all that he was pulled through, McInnes was almost certainly not Bible John. But it took about 4 or 5 months longer than expected to reach that conclusion, while the family are being hounded and everything else. John's brother Hector said after the finding, "This has been a distressing experience. We have never said we would sue, and that is not our intention at the moment. We are delighted at the news." He's a kinder man than I am. I think I'd be straight down the lawyer's office after that.
Yeah, I do remember this at the time. Remember it being on the news.
Yeah.
They were talking about exhuming a body and it being potentially Bible John. I don't remember anything to do with the suicide aspect of it, but I do remember that.
Yeah. Like I say, I think only certain sources would report on that aspect of it. It's tough because the investigators have to follow these leads. You want the investigation to leave no stone unturned. But I do feel heart sorry for McInnes's people in this case. First, they go through losing their family member in such horrible circumstances. Then they have it all dragged up again many years later with this prolonged and very public ordeal. In a way, you can see them, I think anyway, as yet more secondary victims of Bible John. Arguably, you might even call John McInnes a secondary victim of Bible John. Who knows what effect being accused of that kind of crime had on him in his lifetime and how he ended up.
Oh, so was he accused of it beforehand?
Yes, he was one of the original suspects.
Right.
One of many They interviewed dozens upon dozens of people, and he was one of them.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
But I think he wasn't just one of the ones they immediately discounted. I believe he may have gone to the Barrowlands and stuff like that. So there was the police had some reason to suspect him, and to go through all this to actually clear him. But the way that was all treated, what I'm getting at is he may never have been in the situation of wanting to end his life had, this is all entirely speculation, but he not years before been treated as a suspect in a serial killer case. So in a way, this is the ripple effect that crimes like Bible John's have, not just on the immediate victims, but Bible John directly killed 3 people that we know of. How many other lives did he damage? The children, the parents, the families of the victims, the friends, the false suspects, their families. So, yeah, that was John McInnes, cleared. I suppose we should... Anyone who's at all familiar with this case knows that we've been beating around a fairly monumental bush up till now.
Yeah.
Probably not the best phrasing there, but I think now's the time to turn our attention to the most prominent suspect of recent years. For the last decade and a half, there's been one name that has reared its ugly mug every time this case gets brought up, This angle goes back to the year 2006 and another murder that stunned the city of Glasgow. A case that was described in court as sensational and bizarre in the extreme. Angelika Kluk was a 23-year-old Polish student visiting Glasgow on a kind of extended working holiday, I guess you'd call it. She was staying in a room at St Patrick's Roman Catholic Church next to Charing Cross, next to the M8 motorway, and where she was also employed as a temporary cleaner. And this was at least her second trip to Scotland, her second time working at St Patrick's during academic holidays from the University of Gdansk, where she was studying towards, I believe it was a master's degree actually in Scandinavian languages. I think it was a master's, I could be wrong about that. She was, though, by all accounts, a very outgoing, hard-working, intellectual young woman who loved travelling and meeting new people and learning about the world. She would be described by those who knew her as being in love with life. On the 25th of September 2006, Angelika Kluk failed to turn up to work. Angelika was last seen on the 24th by a man she had befriended, church handyman Pat Mclaughlin. At the time, Mclaughlin was working on building a shed in the church grounds, and Angelika was helping him. At this point, she was coming to the end of her summer holiday. She had her plane ticket home to Gdansk, and she was in good spirits and looking forward to returning to university. And then she disappeared. Her family and friends were immediately concerned. Angelika was conscientious, reliable. It was completely out of character for her to just take off without telling anyone. If she just left, she'd left without keys, without identification, without her laptop, passport, plane tickets, without even a coat. She was reported missing. Police became involved. And I remember this quite well, Mike. I'm sure you do too. The appeals for information appearing in the news on the social media sites of the time.
Yeah, I remember all that, yeah.
Nothing. For 4 days, she wasn't seen or heard from. And in those 4 days, even while Angelika was still missing, police hit upon 3 leads. 3 leads pointing in different directions at 3 different suspects who might have had a motive to do her harm. Number 1, it emerged that Angelika had a boyfriend in Glasgow, a 40-year-old chauffeur named Martin Mccaskill, who was married. News items at the time describe him as helping the police with their inquiries, which in Scotland is usually a police code word for "we think you might have done it."
Yeah.
However, it soon emerged that Mccaskill's wife already knew of the affair. I don't think it was an open relationship as such, but it seemed he'd actually been somewhat honest with her about it. She seemed to have tolerated it, even joined him in handing out missing person flyers after Angelika disappeared. So that motive, jealousy or covering up an affair, didn't really hold up to scrutiny. Secondly, and now it starts to get messy, investigators from Strathclyde Police discovered, I think initially through the parishioner gossip network, but later confirmed by the man himself, that 63-year-old Father Jerry Nugent, Angelika's priest, had also been having a sexual affair with Angelika Kluk, an affair which had since soured. Now, this is a supposed celibate, someone whose reputation and career, vocation depends on maintaining that outward appearance. What if, for example, she'd been threatening to expose him, and given the reputation of the Catholic Church in matters of sexual misconduct, there were at the time also questions about the, I guess you'd say, power relationship there. He's a priest, he's 40 years her senior, he's her employer and landlord. Is it possible there's some coercion or manipulation involved there? Assuming, though, that Angelika entered into that as an equal and consenting party, then from a secular perspective anyway, that's their business. But there were a few big question marks there, and damn right the police were interested in him. However, details would soon emerge that would draw police attention in an entirely different direction. Number 3, after talking to the police the day she was reported missing, and telling them he didn't know anything, Pat Mclaughlin, the handyman who last saw and was last seen with Ms. Kluk, also disappeared. It turns out he was not homeless, as he told Father Nugent, and Pat Mclaughlin wasn't his real name. His real name was Peter Tobin. and Peter Tobin was a fugitive. The friendly church handyman who had charmed the priest into giving him work and had befriended Angelica was, in reality, an appallingly violent sex offender. Tobin had previously been sentenced to 14 years in prison for an almost unspeakable attack he carried out down in Hampshire, in England, in which he'd used his young son as bait to lure two 14-year-old girls on the pretense of babysitting. He then forced these girls to drink amitriptyline-laced cider, battered, molested, and stabbed them. He then called his terrified son back into the room to help him clean up the blood. Unbelievable. He'd left the two girls lying in the flat with the kitchen gas taps on, left them for dead. Amazingly, Mike, they survived, and Tobin went to jail for only 10 of those 14 years.
I have no idea how someone commits a crime like that, and I mean, I'm always wary of the government wielding too much power against people and being able to, lock them up indefinitely. Yeah. But, as I've got older, and especially looking into a lot of these sorts of things, I really do feel now there's just some people, I don't believe in capital punishment, but there are some people who just should be indefinitely kept away from public.
He is a case of he needs to be locked up to protect the public.
Yeah.
Without even getting into issues of punishment, he just needs to be locked up to protect the public. Amazingly, these girls survived, and presumably if they had died, he would have gone away for a lot longer. But it seems clear that he was at least attempting to kill them, although he wasn't charged with attempted murder, which is probably, I don't know why, but that's probably why it was for a relatively short period of time. I struggle to get my head around it though. He was released on parole in 2004 and returned to Scotland. His name, of course, was in big bold letters in the sex offenders register, and this meant his movements were closely monitored. That kind of arrangement clearly didn't suit a guy like Tobin. He went AWOL within weeks, and so immediately he became a wanted man again. He took on a string of false identities, staying at a string of different addresses, still within the Glasgow area, it seems. He did odd jobs for cash in hand, and periodically he would go to ground by checking himself into different hospitals under different fake names with fake chest pains or stroke symptoms. And it was around this kind of period that he ingratiated himself at St. Patrick's. The church clearly, at that time, wasn't bothering to do disclosure checks or anything like that. And then, just 6 weeks after he started working there, Angelica disappeared. For 4 days. On the 5th day, Friday the 29th, by which time the search had spread much further afield, police decided to take a closer look at the church itself. This time, they found Angelica. Or rather, her battered, mutilated body dumped in a crawl space beneath the church confessional. She'd been gagged with rags, raped, viciously beaten, and stabbed 16 times. Angelica was in such a condition that when this went to trial, those in the public gallery were ushered out of the room before the photos of the body could be shown. Despite this, forensic evidence suggested she was still alive, dying, but still alive when she was dropped into the vault. Heartbreaking, mate.
Terrifying.
I just can't even conceive of that. They found Peter Tobin soon after in London. When arrested, the 60-year-old was up to his old tricks, hiding out in hospital under a false name with a fictitious illness. Tobin went to trial in early 2007. He pleaded not guilty. His defence attempted to explain why his DNA was all over her by suggesting he and Angelica were in a consensual relationship and that perhaps Nugent had killed her in a fit of jealousy. It didn't fly. Tobin was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 21 years before being eligible for probation. That sounds like he might be getting out in a few years. Spoilers, he's never getting out. Even before the trial was finished, investigators were looking into the possibility that Tobin was a serial killer, and that hunch was very quickly proven correct. Just over a month after Tobin's conviction, Lothian and Borders police also arrested him on suspicion of the murder of Vickie Hamilton, a 15-year-old girl who had disappeared on the 10th of February 1991 from Bathgate. So she disappeared before his crime down south that he'd been in prison for. Bathgate is a town situated between Glasgow and Edinburgh. Vickie was last seen waiting at a bus stop. She'd spent the previous evening at a disco in Livingston with her older sister. On the following day, was making her way home to Falkirk. She hoped to make it back to her mother's house in time to catch the Brit Awards that evening, but she never did. It was snowing heavily that day, and Vickie wasn't too familiar with the bus routes she was relying on to get back. She had to make a couple of connections. Witnesses would later say that she was kind of lost, approaching folk asking for directions. This is the prehistoric era, 1991, 13 or 14 years before Google Maps. It's likely that she had accepted the offer of a lift home from Peter Tobin. Now, Tobin had lived in Bathgate until just a few days after Vickie's disappearance, when he mysteriously up and moved to Margate in the far southeast of England. Vickie Hamilton's body was found buried in the garden at the house Tobin had lived in at Margate. Turns out he had drugged her, sexually assaulted her, and killed her, possibly by strangulation, in Bathgate. And then it would seem he took her corpse with him in the moving van on the 500-mile drive down to Margate. Vickie's remains were in two parts, and he buried her 6 feet deep in his Margate garden before covering the grave in concrete. 4 of Tobin's fingerprints were found on the black plastic in which she was wrapped. Police also found in the attic of his Bathgate residence, the Scottish residence, a blood-stained 10-inch knife. A knife that had likely been used to cut the body in two. In any case, it was covered in Vickie's DNA, and it was still there, still lying behind a ceiling joist in the house 16 years after he moved out. How many tenants or owners had come and gone in that time?
Yeah, it's terrifying.
Yeah, you start to wonder about everywhere you've lived, or... And that house in Margate with the bodies, how many people lived there since and didn't know?
Yeah.
In the back garden?
Yeah, everywhere has a story, and... You do wonder about that sort of thing sometimes. There's a big red handprint in my attic, which I'm pretty convinced someone put there for a laugh.
Sounds like a curse to me.
Yeah, but it looks like something at the Blair Witch. It's just kind
Jesus.
But yeah, like sometimes when I'm up in that attic, sometimes it does play my mind a little bit. I'm kind of like, I'm moving boxes around and all that, and you're just kind of like...
I think you should put a poster of Rita Hayworth over it or something.
Aye, probably.
Anyway, you may notice there that I said bodies because, as you might have guessed, more than one body was indeed found buried in that garden down in Margate. Dinah Mcnichol was an 18-year-old who was last seen hitchhiking home from the 1991 Torpedo Town Festival in Liphook. It was a very old-school, anarchic, smoky kind of arts and music fair that used to run on a weekend in August most years through the 80s and early 90s. Dinah was right in the target demographic for that. She had a hippie-ish thing going on, wore her hair in dreads or a headscarf, but she also liked a bit of rave music, a bit of rock. She was a huge Talking Heads fan, super outgoing, really friendly, hugely popular, loved the party. But she also seemed to be a woman with her head screwed on. She'd saved a considerable amount of money, for an 18-year-old anyway, that she planned to use for study and travel. She was working towards her A-levels. She was looking at universities. She was in that perfect stage of life where you're just stepping on the threshold of full adulthood, and every option, every joy, every possibility is spread out on the horizon in front of you. And she just seems to have been someone making the absolute most of that. Wish I could say I did. Living her youth very, very well. She was described by one friend as a kind person, a deep person. Her story wasn't entirely without hardship. She'd lost her mother in a car crash when she was 6, and that must have been devastating to her growing up. But despite that, like Angelica Kluck, and I'm sure Vickie Hamilton as well, although I haven't found as much about her personally, unfortunately, I think it would be fair to say that Dinah Mcnichol was someone in love with life. And I guess that was something a shit stain like Peter Tobin just couldn't bear to see. At the festival, Dinah befriended a guy called David Tremlett. a friendly, helpful, hippie kind of guy in his mid-20s, and he agreed to help her hitch a ride back after the festival. The pair of them got a lift from a man at a service station on the A3. Now, Dinah's not a big girl. She's 4'10". She's only just turned 18. But this is not a wee lassie thumbing rides herself. She's with a 6-foot-tall guy friend who's also getting in the car. It's broad daylight. I don't believe she felt in any danger or that she was taking any kind of risk there. The driver of that car was Peter Tobin. Soon after, Tobin's neighbour saw him digging a chest-deep trench in his backyard. The neighbour joked with him, asked him if he was going for Australia. Tobin explained he was making a sandpit for his son. 2 days later, that hole was filled in, smoothed over, not a grain of sand in sight. Peter Tobin, I'll just say at this point, because I don't want to get sidelined too much onto the Vickie Hamilton and Dinah Mcnichol trials. It's getting late here. Peter Tobin was convicted of both murders and was now sentenced to a full life term. Not life with a minimum of however many years, a full life term. Never getting out. Okay, I realise I've been talking about Tobin's crimes for quite a bit. We haven't forgotten about Bible John, and this is where we come back to him. At the trial for the Dinah Mcnichol murder, David Tremlett gave evidence and talked about that car ride in August 1991. He told how he and Dinah had been heading to different destinations. David had got out at a junction 8 of the M25, I think it was, because he was heading to Surrey, while Dinah remained in the car with Tobin, who promised to take her most of the way back to her home in Essex. He talked about how the driver, who didn't give his name, had given him a strange vibe, seemed too chatty and overly familiar with Dinah especially, and talked about things that seemed self-aggrandizing, you might say. He also opened the windows of the car so that the noise made it difficult for David sitting in the back seat to hear what the two in the front seats were talking about. Tremlett would talk about how after he got out of the car, he'd had a really strange feeling about the driver and tried to catch the license plate as Tobin drove off with Mcnichol in the passenger seat, but he wasn't able to.
Why would he get out? Why would you get out and then be looking at the license plate afterwards as it's driving away?
He got out, and then he had, essentially the way he put it was...
Not that I want to make the man feel bad, obviously it's probably haunted him for the rest of his life.
You have to remember that we're looking at this with the benefit of hindsight, knowing this is a serial killer. He just kind of thought, this guy's, something odd about this guy, I can't quite put his finger on it. Mm-hmm. But then after he got out of the car, after he was standing on the pavement, he suddenly had a chilling thought that he was leaving that girl in the car with a guy who seemed weird. It seemed to take on a different aspect at that point.
Fair enough.
And then he looked up, but by that time, he's speeding off. But, I want you to cast your mind back, Mike, to the last episode, to Helen Puttock's sister Jeannie's recollection of that fatal cab ride she'd shared with her sister and her sister's killer. You can't help but notice some striking similarities here. In fact, there's a little bit of contradictory information out there, but some sources actually indicate, Mike, that Peter Tobin made comments about a cousin hitting a hole-in-one.
Oh, no way.
And saying that he didn't drink at Hogmanay on the drive with Dinah and David. However, do treat that with some caution, because that information, as far as I can tell, seems to stem from a quote by Professor David Wilson, who was at the trial. And when you read his precise wording, it's a bit ambiguous as to whether he's saying Tobin actually said those things, or whether he's saying he's using the same weird conversation technique. You know what I mean? So, but either way, it's quite uncanny. David Wilson, who is a professor of criminology and now presents the BBC Scotland TV show David Wilson's Crime Files. You ever watched that, Mike?
No, I've never watched it, no. Any good?
You should check it out, it's really, really good.
Can't really take the name seriously because I knew a guy called Davy Wilson.
I think everyone knows a Davy Wilson.
Well, I say I knew, in fact I can't tell this story.
You can't smear an innocent.
Yeah, I can't. It's not me that would get into trouble, someone else would get into trouble. So
okay, you can tell me after the podcast. Okay. So David Wilson has stated that hearing Tremlett's testimony for him, set off a chain reaction of connections in his head that has led to him becoming absolutely convinced that Peter Tobin and Bible John are one and the same. Tobin did live in Glasgow during the Bible John series. Photos of him from that time show a young man with undeniable similarities to Jeannie's description and that infamous artist impression. The surname that was given by Bible John to Helen Puttock, which Jeannie only partially heard and thought might have been John Templeton or John Sempleson, is very similar to one of the false names given by Peter Tobin during his malingering hospital stays, Paul Semple. Tobin is known to have had a tooth removed at some point in his past. The sources I could find for that are not precise about when, but most say late 60s. Is it possible that he had this done to get rid of the overlapping incisor that Jeannie described?
Was it reported in the newspapers at the time, looking for someone with that crooked tooth?
Yes, so if you go back to, in fact I think I mentioned it when I quoted the article from the press conference where the cops describe the man that they're looking for, they definitely mentioned the overlapping tooth. And that was something that the police were specifically looking for, so it does make you wonder, he's had this tooth removed. It's a weird thing. Tobin is also a staunch Roman Catholic with, at least outwardly, some unusually strong and conservative religious views. And as we've touched upon, he seems to have felt very much at home around religious institutions and more than once hid himself in religious communities when trying to evade the law. A common feature of Bible John's series of murders and Peter Tobin's is the killing of women who were notably independent, bright, outgoing, carefree, extroverted, women who were going out and having fun on their terms and doing stuff in a very independent way. Neither of them seem to have killed any meek, stay-at-home, timid kind of women. And that may just be an artifact of the people the killer or killers had access to, but I have my doubts about that. When you look at it in the light of Bible John's vitriolic comments about what he called adulterous women, and when you look at the kind of relationships Peter Tobin had with the women in his life, it comes together frighteningly well. I think, to Peter Tobin, women are subservient objects who exist to satisfy his sexual desires or his home comforts. And the idea of women having their own lives, their own wants, their own personalities, going out and doing stuff out with the control of a man is something abhorrent and challenging to his whole worldview.
You read a lot about that, about serial killers or people that brutalise women having this, almost this idea that all women are whores, essentially.
Yeah. It's the, what do you call that again? The, is it the whore Madonna complex or something, where to certain people and in certain cultures of men, women tend to be viewed as either an absolute pinnacle of chaste morality or an absolute slut who's to be despised, and there's no in between. Men are allowed all these layers of ambiguity in the middle, but women are seen as existing only at these extremes. And I definitely think that was true for Peter Tobin. Peter Tobin was married 3 times. And unfortunately, all 3 of his former wives described what were more like extended violent hostage situations than partnerships. And supposedly, they have all said that Tobin reacted violently to the female menstrual cycle. I think we all have an idea of what an abusive relationship looks like, but Tobin's behaviour takes that almost beyond the horizon of what is easily imaginable to me. His first wife, Margaret, who, I'm just looking into the dates actually, and it seems he might have met her in the downtime between Bible John's first and second killings, so the beginning of that relationship could well have accounted for the 18-month gap in the murders. She described an initial charm that almost immediately gave way to violence and sexual assault. And Margaret first met Tobin at the Barrowlands Ballroom in 1968. I'm going to say skip forward a couple of minutes here if either domestic violence or animal cruelty are likely to cause you undue distress. While living with Margaret, Tobin would disappear for days on end, leaving her locked in their flat. God knows what he was doing. And then he'd randomly come home just to beat the shit out of her. He forced her to marry him in 1969 under threat of violence. He forged her parents' signatures on the marriage license. You see what I mean when I say hostage situation?
Yeah.
Margaret only seems to have survived through presenting as passive and meek a persona around him as possible. One time she did stand up to him was when I warn you man, this is grim, he gave her a puppy as a gift.
Oh no, do we have to go here?
Let her fall in love with it, and then he killed it. Margaret was devastated, furious, and lashed out at him. Tobin, I won't describe this in too much detail, but he sexually assaulted Margaret using a knife in such a way that she would be unable to conceive children for the rest of her life. Utter
bastard,
horrendous shit stain of a human being. He walked out, he left her for dead. She would have died. And she was only saved because the man who lived in the flat below came home to find her blood pouring through the ceiling and called an ambulance.
Oh my God.
Tobin was such an effective terrorist. It was only months later when he was arrested for another crime that she was able to properly escape. His third wife, Kathy Wilson, wrote a book about her experiences called Escape from Evil. She describes an almost identical pattern of abuse. I don't think there's any point in me repeating myself by going over the kind of things he did. It's all very similar and depressing. However, I will say that she was forced to watch him tie up and beat sex workers that he brought home, and that Kathy, believed she survived Tobin because, I quote, "What saved me was having his child. I became a possession and not a victim." And I think that says it all about the human turd that is Peter Tobin. It's also worth mentioning that Tobin left Glasgow with Margaret, with his first wife, for the south of England around the time of the final Barrowland killing, and some have suggested this explains why the killing stopped, that in fact he didn't stop, he simply moved elsewhere. This seems to be a feature of Tobin's life, moving up and down between the south of England and the Scottish Central Belt to avoid attention, to avoid arrest. There are several unsolved murders in southeast England and in Scotland with similar features that some, including Professor David Wilson, believe are linked to Tobin and represent his activities between 1969 and 1991. These include Jessie Earle, who disappeared in 1980. Her body was found in bushes at Beachy Head 9 years later. Tobin lived just a few miles away at the time. In Scotland, there's Pamela Hastie, aged 16, strangled and dumped in some woods near Tobin's hometown of Johnston. An investigation called Operation Anagram was set up to explore these links. Lots of circumstantial connections have been found, but nothing has yet gone to trial. I think that at this stage nothing more will, unfortunately. I doubt he's in a fit state to stand trial for anything else, but we'll come to that. Operation Anagram is currently wound down but not closed. It could be reactivated if new evidence comes to light. One tantalising, albeit grim, piece of information. Is there any other kind of information when it comes to Peter Tobin?
Doesn't sound like it. He had a wonderful singing voice.
This piece of information uncovered by Operation Anagram on a BBC Crime Watch appeal was a woman who came forward to say that she'd met a man at the Barrowlands in 1968, a man she now recognised based on contemporary photos as Peter Tobin. She described him as polite, charming. She didn't leave with him, but instead arranged to meet him for a drink at a Glasgow pub on another date. She believes he then spiked her drink, and the next thing she knew, she was being assaulted by Tobin in a tenement stairway. Afterwards, she considered contacting the police, but feared she wouldn't be believed. I can't help but wonder if this gives us an answer to the menstruation question. Remember I said there might be another explanation for why Bible John's 3 victims were all menstruating. Was Peter Tobin habitually stalking the Barrowlands ballroom, spiking and forcing himself on women he met there but only going the extra distance, only progressing to murder when he discovered his victims were menstruating in the course of carrying out these assaults.
Yeah, it's very possible.
I can't help but think that that might be the reason. As his wives attested, it was something that, for some bizarre, unknown reason, drove him into a rage. I think this could be the answer to that question. It doesn't require that he knew his victims were menstruating, but it would suggest that Jemima MacDonald, Helen Puttock, and Patricia Docker were only 3 of many victims at that time, the rest of whom he didn't kill, but who either didn't report the assault, or in the cultural climate of the 1960s, simply weren't believed. Which, again, opens up a whole other avenue of things he might have done. In any case, it's extremely rare for a serial killer to begin murdering in his mid-40s, which was Tobin's age in 1991. His history of violence prior to that, his apparent attempted murder of Margaret, huge gaps in his known history, his whereabouts for large chunks of the 70s and 80s are a total blank, would all seem to suggest that he may have killed before 1991. In prison, he himself has boasted of murdering 48 women.
Really? Oof.
Of course.
It seems very unlikely to me that, and maybe he's grandstanding, a lot of people do, but I certainly think it's very unlikely that he's not got other victims, certainly earlier.
Oh yeah, and you're right. I think the point about you say about him grandstanding is a good one. I think exaggerated boasting is all scum like him has going for them in prison. So the number may well be lower than what he says it is, but still, yeah. When asked at interview, and this seems to hint at more victims in a police interview context, this is the closest he's come. When asked at interview, are you not interested in helping families who may have missed ones that you might have information about? Tobin said, and I quote, "I couldn't give a fuck."
Prick.
There's no two sides to him, there's just arsehole all the way through. You
realise with someone like Peter Tobin that the word evil gets used a lot, but there are people who, I don't know, maybe not quite as bad as him, but who knows, but I've met a couple of people in my life who I consider to be evil.
Yeah.
And I normally believe that most people can be redeemed.
Yeah.
But, and I remember my dad always said, I don't know if I mentioned this in another podcast episode, but, you know, that he used to interview a lot of abusers.
Yeah.
And he said, you know, he went into that line of work believing that everyone could be saved and everyone could be redeemed. And he didn't believe in ultimate evil. And even though my dad was very much, he was an atheist, there was almost a spiritual component to it, where he was like, you know, I remember him sitting a few times just saying to me, like, I've sat across the table from evil.
Yeah.
From actual evil. And then he said, it's unlike anything else that you will encounter. Yeah. You know it when you meet it. You know, that's the type of thing that obviously can be applied to Tobin.
I feel like maybe people who end up becoming like that, it's almost like they've gone so far down a path that they're like, all I can do is go all in and make everything about me this way. Most people are a mix of good and bad. You know, even good and bad sounds like it's oversimplifying things, but it's almost like some people are intentionally evil, quote unquote. You know, like they know it and they're just going, I'm just going to wear it and be that. I'm going to be that, you know. I
think that could very much be a definition of what evil is, because you look at some people who commit terrible acts, and sometimes you feel that there's a compulsion within them. You know, so some people may have like a sexual compulsion, and I'm not excusing it at all, but like I'm just saying that's a contributing factor.
I would say that in Tobin's case that's definitely true, but
yeah, but what I'm saying is that I think where the kind of next level evil, as it were, is when someone embraces that, and not only embraces it but enjoys it. And it's an enjoyment that's not just sexual gratification or just power. It's like an enjoyment of causing pain. You mentioned Albert Fish earlier on. as a serial killer in America, and he very famously wrote letters to the parents and families of his victims.
Yeah, I think at a certain point, malice becomes
goading them,
yeah,
describing what he did to their children, and saying how much he enjoyed it. And
Albert Fish is probably, I would say Peter Tobin's pretty close, and Bible John are pretty close to being among the worst, but I think Albert Fish might just take the cake in terms of most, quote, evil serial killers.
Martin, I don't think you should be handing out cakes to serial killers. I mean, I don't know. I mean, it seems very ridiculous. I mean, they're pretty bad guys, yeah. No, I think cake's completely out of the question.
Currently, as of late February 2020, he's rotting in jail. His health is failing, and he's riddled with cancer, addicted to morphine, and reportedly weighs just 5 stone. He could pretty much drop at any minute. Tabloid news stories, they're still at it. They claim his only friend on the inside is a transgender paedophile named Kendra Larking, who was imprisoned in 2016 as Kenneth Larking for violently abusing a 12-year-old girl. She now pushes Tobin around in a wheelchair, and these tabloid news stories have claimed that the pair may be in a sexual relationship. Considering Tobin's treatment of women who he apparently deemed to be too transgressive, I think that's quite ironic. But, you know, I'm sure they've got a lot to talk about. Was he Bible John? I'm about 80 or 85% on that. The case against him is compelling, but it's all circumstantial. Police have never been able to test the theory using DNA because the samples have deteriorated beyond usefulness since John Mckenna was cleared. Testing against that doesn't seem to be possible now. There are a few things that don't line up perfectly with Tobin being John. I don't want to close that door entirely. Tobin doesn't match Jeannie's description perfectly. Although there's a facial resemblance, she described a 6-foot+ guy with reddish hair. He's 5'8" with dark brown or black hair. Then again, it's dark, they're in dance halls.
Type of shoes were they wearing?
Yeah, blue suede shoes.
I don't mean like foot high heels, but I know I legitimately mean that there are people that would have heels on their shoes that would maybe even give them an extra inch.
Yeah, that's actually a good point. I hadn't thought of that. But what I was going to say was that in terms of the hair colour, you got to remember they're in dance halls. They're out in the streets at night, or they're in taxi cabs. You got these yellow street lights and indoor lights. It's hard to tell colour in artificial light. You know, if you stand out on a street at night and it doesn't have the daylight balanced LED lights that's using the old kind of orangey yellow street lights, telling colour in those lights, if you can find a street that still has them, try and identify the colour of the cars. Not easy. So, no. Tobin also seems to have moved to Brighton with his first wife shortly before Helen Puttock's murder. And Margaret has said that she's sure he could not have been in Glasgow at the time. On the other hand, this is a guy who used to disappear for long periods and lock her in the house, and it was a very long time ago, so not to undermine her recollection, but it doesn't seem impossible that he could have travelled back up for one last fling. There is also some vague suggestion that he might have been under arrest at the time of one of the Bible John killings. I haven't been able to find much on that, so I'm not too sure. Some people point to apparent differences between Tobin's killings and Bible John's killings. Differences in MO. Tobin buried or concealed his victims. Bible John left his in the open. Yeah, maybe. Vickie Hamilton and Dinah Mcnichol were buried. Angelina Kluck was thrown into a void space under the church floor. But the 2 girls he attacked and left for dead in Hampshire, the ones that are often forgotten about because they survived, he left them where they were. Arguably he wasn't finished with them, I guess. Margaret, when he attacked her with the serrated bread knife, left her apparently on the assumption that she was bleeding to death. He didn't move her or try to conceal her. Some of his other unproven but likely victims were left where they fell or were hastily thrown into bushes. I don't know if he was a creature of habit in that regard, certainly less so than a lot of other killers. Or maybe he killed over such a long time, his habits evolved. The later attacks seem to have taken place in his home or his car or his place of work, locations he was in control of, so he had more time and the means available to conceal the bodies, which he didn't have in a lane behind some tenements. That may also speak to the situation with Helen Puttock, where she may have almost got the better of him. He perhaps changed to killing and attacking people in locations he had more control over, and actually some of his later victims were very small in stature, such as Dinah Mcnichol. Dinah Mcnichol was 4'10", which barely counts as an adult height, I think. The same goes for the claim Bible John strangled and Tobin used a knife. Oh, they can't be the same person. Could just be a practical thing. Maybe he'd have preferred to stab the Bible John victims, but the hunting ground was more important to him than the weapon. Probably not so easy to bring a big knife out with you when you're going to the dance hall. You're going to draw a lot of unwanted attention if the bouncers find a blade on you.
Escalation as well, that we've talked about a few times.
Escalation, exactly. Yeah, you're moving from, maybe even like in the first ones, it could be he hadn't intended to go out to kill, and in the later ones he got a taste for it and he started taking a weapon. Yeah, you're absolutely right, that's also possible. Anyway, there were signs of strangulation on Vickie Hamilton's body, in addition to knife wounds. There's not so much info about how he killed Dinah Mcnichol, but he habitually, and this is unpleasant, but he habitually choked his ex-wives. So yeah, I'm not too sure either way on that one. Some think that Angus Sinclair, another serial killer who was responsible for the World's End murders over in Edinburgh, may have been behind at least one of the victims. I don't want to get too much into Sinclair, as that's a whole other episode, but that's a slim possibility, I guess. Others think it's a case of 3 different killings by 3 different men getting lumped together. Statistically possible, but I think it's very unlikely. According to Paul Harrison, a former detective, FBI-trained profiler, and author of the book Dancing with the Devil, D.S. Joe Beattie, the lead investigator in 1969, who died in 1989, became convinced towards the end of the original investigation that the real Bible John was in fact a police officer. But he was silenced by his superiors, who were more fearful of a scandal hurting public trust in the police than letting a mad killer stay at large. They shuttered the investigation when they realised he was looking into his own men. And this suspect was not just a police officer. Beattie had a specific police officer in mind, one apparently positively identified by Jeannie as being the man she met that night.
That's unreal.
Yeah, but Beattie's investigation seemed to confirm the officer's guilt. I guess his whereabouts placed him near the crimes or whatever. Jeannie apparently also pointed out that the mysterious identification card that Bible John flashed to Helen, remember he flashed an identification card and then wouldn't let Jeannie see it? Jeannie thought that was uncannily similar to the warrant cards officers showed her during questioning. Remember also the commanding way John spoke to the club manager?
I was just thinking of that when you were mentioning that.
Yeah, and Castle Milk John's gut feeling that Helen's John was a cop. Unfortunately, Jeannie died in 2010, so she can't confirm any of these claims. Harrison states that after the investigation was shut down, the officer under suspicion was pensioned off on quote-unquote health grounds, and he moved away to the Scottish Highlands. In 2013, he tracked down this man, who he hasn't been able to name publicly for obvious legal reasons, and this ex-cop was still living up north, and in fact, Harrison thinks he may have since killed again up there. Nothing has really come out of that since the book came out. We can probably assume Police Scotland have looked into it and discounted him, but you never know. The whole thing is a bit of a wild card, a bit of a conspiracy theory, but is it possible? I wouldn't stake my house against it.
Bit of a Hollywood ending, isn't it?
Yeah.
But it would make sense with certain things, like you mentioned, and the fact that he evaded capture.
Yeah.
Earlier on when you were talking about it, I was thinking, if he was a high-ranking police officer, he might have had the arrogance to think that he could do these things and return to the Barrowlands again, even when other police officers are there. But then, would he be afraid of getting identified?
Well, this is the thing, right? Because according to this claim, Jeannie actually saw this guy working in the police station when she went to do a lineup.
Oh, can you imagine?
She looked across the office and pulled Joe Beattie aside and said, "That guy over there, that's Bible John." And I don't think he believed it at first, but then slowly...
Jeannie's never said this publicly, though. Is it just Beattie that's...
After the investigation took place, she kind of went off the radar. She didn't do any interviews, or... She died in I think it was 2010, but she didn't really speak to press or anything like that. And we don't really know what was spoken about behind the scenes between her and the police. I mean, it's, as I say, it's a possibility. It's an outsider, but yeah, I wouldn't be incredibly surprised if that was the case. But that's Bible John. That's Bible John, Scotland's unknown serial killer. The smart money, I think, is on Peter Tobin, but I don't think we'll ever know that for sure. The knowledge that's in his head about unnamed victims, about the ones he got away with, whether those are Bible John's victims or not, the information that could provide some seed of solace to grieving families is the one thing he still holds that gives him any kind of power over others. And like most psychopaths, power of one kind or another is what he lives for. He's shown time and again that he has no conscience, no compassion, so why would he give up the only source of joy he has left in his miserable little life, the only sick joy he has, tormenting the families from inside his cell just by keeping his mouth shut? Tobin's going to die very, very soon, and if he does know anything, then he'll more than likely take that to his grave, unfortunately.
There is this assumption made about psychopathic serial killers that, as we keep talking about escalation, but the murders will keep coming until the person's caught or they die. And I think that I don't know if that assumption holds true, because there may just be a missing data point. There may be people who actually go and kill
and then stop
2 or 3 times. They actually do it in a serial way, and then that's it. They've done it.
There are definitely killers who killed for a period of time and then stopped, either permanently or for a long, long time. If you look at the alleged original Night Stalker, Golden State Killer, Joseph DeAngelo, stopped killing in the 80s. Apparently, as far as we know, hasn't killed anyone since then. He recently was caught based on familial DNA. He simply stopped. He had kids, he had a marriage. BTK, Dennis Rader, he stopped for 2 decades or so, and then he started sending notes to the police to taunt them. I think he had a family, and that took up a lot of his time, and he found other interests that he focused on that kept him away from it, but he still kind of slowly started coming back. He started taunting police, and there's some suggestion that he may have actually started stalking some new victims decades after his last crime. I think his kids grew up and left home, or were getting to the age where he wasn't so involved with them anymore, so he started having more time on his hands again, and that started...
terrifying thing to think that brutal killers can compartmentalise like that, because that's how they pull the wool over people's eyes.
It is. But if there's any glimmer of positivity we can take from all this, if there's anything I've learned while researching this case that's made me feel better, it's that a killer like Bible John probably couldn't operate in today's connected society. Guys like Peter Tobin are, touch wood, a dying breed. For all the downsides that come with living in a borderline surveillance state, and it's not something I'm super cool with. Our connected world is a mixed blessing at best, I think, but if there's any good in that, it's that CCTV, camera phones, social media, contactless payments, automatic number plate recognition, DNA profiling, police national databases, everything else,
Frank Drebin,
make for a much more hazardous environment for a killer like Tobin. Today, someone stalking the Barrowlands would be on CCTV. He'd be in the background of a dozen Barrowland hashtag Instagram posts from that night. Crimes happening at opposite ends of the country in different jurisdictions would have common features flagged automatically on the police national computer. Not to be complacent, people with the serial killer mindset still exist. It may seem like there are fewer of them today, but there are probably just as many, if not more. However, it does seem to be a fact that they are being caught more often, and they're being caught earlier, after or even before their first serious offence sometimes. Not to say there'll never be another serial killer or that serial killers aren't active right now, but there's certainly fewer of them, and fewer of them getting away with it for as long. Look, for example, at, do you remember a few years ago in Glasgow, the student Karen Buckley?
I was about to talk about this, yeah, and the guy went and, did he hide her body in a barrel or something like that?
Yeah, that's the one, yeah. So this is a crime that had a lot of parallels to Bible John. Karen was lured from the Sanctuary nightclub in Glasgow's West End by 21-year-old Alex Pacteau to his car on Kelvin Way, where he killed her by beating her with a spanner. He then disposed of her body at a farm inside a barrel of chemicals. So yeah, you're right. Pacteau had previously been accused of a rape. He was obsessed with fantasies of violence. I fully believe he would have gone on to kill again if police didn't have him on CCTV, didn't have tagged photos of him from that night, didn't have electronic parking records on his car. Pacteau was an obsessive killer stopped after one murder. He never got the chance to become the next Bible John. Too late for Karen, regrettably, but I'm certain that there are other women who wouldn't be walking among us right now if he hadn't been caught. So, if there's one upside to all this, I think it's that. Anyway, you doing anything nice this week?
I just give it lying down after this. No, it's one of these things again that we've spoken about before, that when you're doing covering these sorts of cases, it is fascinating. It's fascinating because it is so out with the common experience, and there's the detective aspect to it as well. But as we always say, we try to put the victims at the centre of the story.
Yeah.
But it is hard to... This is why the next episode will be something that's far lighter, because we've said ourselves... Because I was actually thinking it might be good to do a little mini episode at some point about like how we put episodes of the show together. And like the fact is that we write scripts for it.
Yeah.
Both of us aren't talking from a script, but whoever's hosting that show has to do all the research and has to write many thousands of words. And
giving away all our secrets here, Mick.
I know. Yeah, like it's not all scripted, but I'm just saying that one person... Do you know what? Cut all this. Fucking hell, just cut it, man. No, I was just going to say that...
I'd be worried if I was remembering all these details about serial killers off the top of my head.
Yeah, doing that, it does have an impact on you as well, a negative impact. And that's why, like I've said before, like I enjoy true crime documentaries, but I'll watch one.
Yeah.
Or maybe two. I'll give myself a long break before I watch anything like that again.
Yeah, you can only swim in the sewer for so long before you need a break.
Well, I like swimming in raw sewage. I love it. That's a Naked Gun. I've dropped 2 Naked Gun and Police Squad references into this podcast, and Martin, please do leave them in.
Oh yeah, they're getting left.
Because there will be someone out there who's a fan of Police Squad. I have 10 years from now, I want to get an email from someone saying, the day you mentioned Frank Drebin changed my life.
So I just want to say before we go, thanks so much for listening, everyone. If you'd like to support us, the best way to do that is to give us a review on iTunes, tweet us, or the most valuable thing anyone can do for us, tell a friend, share the podcast with like-minded people. We will be eternally grateful. Mike, it's getting late. Well, it's getting early, actually.
I know, it's so late, it's now early.
I've got to get up for a flight in the morning. So I guess we better get some kip. Well, folks, the sun is coming up.
The sun is coming up, mate.
Take care, everyone.
Good night.
Good night, then.
That was an absolute session.